All right, so this is the introductory lecture on genre and form, and I call it an invitation to an academic conversation on the power of literature. What is this for? Why do we read it? Not write it, because we're not writers, right? Why do we read it? Storytelling is universal and is as ancient as humankind. Before there was writing, there was storytelling. It occurs in every culture and from every age. It exists and existed to entertain, to inform, and to promulgate cultural traditions and values. That's from a National Geographic article. Stories bring facts to life, make the abstract concrete, and through meaning making, walk the listener through the mind of the scientist or the mathematician. Mostly everyone in this class is one of those. To understand the value and application of such concepts. Wells argued that storytelling is a fundamental means of meaning making. No matter what discipline you're from, the story that comes out of it is the way you're going to communicate what it means. And that's from New York University. When you think of genres of literature, if you do, you probably think of something like this graph. And in the graph, there is, it's broken down into fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and drama, short stories, myths, tales, legends, novels, that's part of the fiction, and nonfiction, diaries, biographies, essays, speeches, so forth and so on. Under poetry, there's so many kinds of poetry, right? Sonnets, ballads, pastoral, lyric. In drama, comedies and tragedies, tragicomedies, farce, melodrama, pantomime. This doesn't even look at film and TV, right? Or video games, which is the genre of your generation. And at some point, I'm going to need to get conversant on that. But you might think about the narrative importance of video games if you're a gamer. So this is what we're going to talk about this semester, but really in a more complex, more detailed way. So I'm not going to stay sky level in genre. We're going to drill down and look at some samples so I can show you how they have worked. This overview is behind what we'll talk about. But I've gone ahead and narrowed down our focus on genre to some what I think are very cool sub-genres that I love to work with so we can explore function, right? Sometimes I'm going to ask you, what was this writer thinking, right? What did they want? But that is in some ways called the authorial fallacy, which is to say that we could ever figure out what a writer wanted a text to do. Sometimes you have direct quotes. But it's not as important what the writer wanted the text to do as what the text actually does. And we show how the text works by doing close reading analysis. When I read this line of this poem, I feel this way, and it makes me want to change in this way, right? So that's how a text functions, and that's how it's really more focused on the response of the reader, which is a whole focus called reader response that I'm working on over and over again. It is a specific lens of cultural and literature analysis, the reader response, but that's my preference. Okay, so just to let you know, you might go into another classroom and the professor might be all just about symbolism, right? Or about feminism, or about Jungian analysis, right? Or they might do all of those things. But mostly what I do on the 200 level is work on the reader response analysis, which is what happens to you when you read this text and what happens to culture when this text is read. And reading also means viewing a film, right? So just get in the habit of when I say reading is receiving, right? You're either reading the literature or viewing a film. We'll ask ourselves why things are written, and most importantly, what effect do they have on the readers? This is the key question on the semester. How do these texts change us, and more importantly, our very culture? So I'll walk you through sort of some stuff, not starting at the beginning of time, but let's start with early America. because I am primarily an American literature specialist. I tend to have samples from America, although sometimes they come from other places. But it keeps me from having to go to the beginning of time to think about, hey, how was American culture created and the values of American culture instilled through early American literature? So, who wrote early American text? Why were they written and what did they do? So, what are some of the earliest American literature texts you can think of? Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Do you guys know that was a true story? Right? You guys have seen the TV series or read the books?
TV series.
So it's a really great TV series. Did I tell you guys this the other day? That like I very often will be like, what would Laura do in this situation? All right, so you got that from me. Okay. But she actually was a memoirist of the pioneers, and she definitely established that sort of character of independent, of not scared of anything, able to live out in the woods alone, able to also get educated and go into the city and get educated, so they didn't just stay country and didn't need to know what the world was doing. They became educators. And she wrote these memoirs, and she was really influential in establishing a certain kind of American independent frontierswoman. That's a good example. What's another one? Earliest American literature text you can think of? Okay, that's not too early since that's sort of mid-1900s, but yeah, okay, so what does that do, the To Kill a Mockingbird? That establishes the whole ethos of Alabama. According to the story, what is Alabama like? No, not racist, not in that story. He's a hero lawyer, and he's going to save everyone and do the right thing. Right? Alabama used to be racist, but it was fixed in To Kill a Mockingbird during that time period, right? Bryan Stevenson, in the beginning of his book, Just Mercy, is a lawyer. He runs the Equal Justice Initiative, in which he tries to get people off of death row. He wrote the book Just Mercy about trying to free a particular man in Alabama who was on death row and, in his opinion, had been falsely convicted of murder. So they end up getting him off. But Bryan Stevenson starts the book with how weird it is to be a lawyer, a justice lawyer in Alabama, and like you go into somewhere in the state offices in Montgomery, there are all these quotes from To Kill a Mockingbird. And so the hero of Alabama legal system is a lawyer that never existed, a fake character who actually didn't save his client, right? But that is the sort of pinnacle of lawyerness, and it comes from a fiction, right? It didn't really, right, make things better. The Alabama prison system is one of the chief humanitarian crises of human history. Not just Alabama, but Alabama's at the top of it, right? So I say a little tongue-in-cheek that To Kill a Mockingbird solved the problem, but it did try and present a sort of ethical person, a white savior who could help, right? I prefer Bryan Stevenson, but also, how many of you were raised on the story of To Kill a Mockingbird and it's important to you? Okay, this is good examples. All right, other examples. The Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton. And you guys just went, Alexander Hamilton. I know you did. Okay, so what were those Federalist Papers? What genre were those? They're nonfiction. They're specifically legal papers, right? He's a political person in office sending out these pamphlets, right? Pamphleteer, a pamphlet to change the way and create a new sort of legal system, right? So they're essays, they're articles, they're journalism. All right. There's a short story called The Witch Trial at Mount Holly, and not by Thomas Jefferson. I got that one wrong. By Ben Franklin. So again, those are notes. We'll need to fix that. What do you think that is? What kind of stuff did Ben Franklin write? Did you guys ever read about him? He had newspapers. He was an inventor. He did all kind of stuff. This is a satire, making fun of how people were trying to convict witches based on things like spectral evidence, which they were, right? So the values that are coming out of this are American freedom, are American entrepreneurialism, the printing press, really important, right? All those Federalist Papers, print, 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 print. Benjamin Franklin, print, 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 print. Then you have all these old autobiographies of presidents, right? How to be a great man in America, right? Those are the ethics that are coming out. You also have, has anybody ever read the letters between John and Abigail Adams? They're really beautiful. They're very intimate. The reason we have them is because when you're president, all of your private letters are kept for posterity and stuck underneath the glass, and you can go see them in a museum, right? Because people see all your private stuff. Well, Abigail was constantly trying to get John to what she called consider the ladies, and try and get him to give them the voting rights, to give them ownership of the property that they ran. Like, these guys would go to Washington and do all their political stuff, leaving their wives at home to run the farms that they didn't even own, actually, right? So you have Abigail going, this kind of sucks, right? And then John writes back to her and says, oh, you know, we listen to you in private, but if we let you have the vote, it would be the despotism of the petticoat, is what he called it, which meant that he was afraid women would take over if they had the ability to vote. And so may as well just talk to your husbands in the kitchen, right? So you see how those older texts created a culture, right? So those letters, you might say, nobody read those letters. It's not true. People did read those letters. They were public. So moving on, one of the first most popular texts in American literature is a story called A Narrative of the Captivity and Restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. Have you ever heard of a captivity narrative? So these were very popular. This is where white women would get abducted by Indians and talk about their hardships, right? This book was read as much as the Bible when it came out. In many colonial households, there were only 2 books. You know, this is not a book culture, right? There was an abbreviation of the Bible and this whole damn story, right? So what did that create? And what did it reflect? Right, it created a fear of Native Americans or indigenous Americans. It created a stereotype that they were violent and the whites, especially women, were innocent. And in it, she talks about the death of one of her children. Well, there's nothing more persuasive that's going to get a country to go beat up on somebody than a mama who's losing her baby, right? So this galvanized all of these wars among the colonists and the Native Americans. What she doesn't say is that the people in her colony had attacked this particular tribe over and over and over again, and what she's talking about is a counterattack after much propagation. And guess whose families and which group lost more lives? Right. So, but it creates this story and it creates this frenzy, right? So you can see, let's see how much of this do I want to read. This incident is the basis of Rowlandson's extraordinary account of her captivity among the Indians. It's a short book. It was printed in Massachusetts in 1682. She became the founder of a significant literary and historical genre, the captivity narrative, which was also the first book in English published by a woman in North America. It's a bestseller. And she's very, very emotional, but she's also very, very Christian and Puritan. So she viewed Native American culture as barbaric, and so what she's writing about is her opportunity to evangelize about God to this Native American culture and how God will exact his revenge And also, I don't know how he's going to do revenge and convert them, but that's what her plan is, right? Okay. Then there's another kind of narrative. These are first-person nonfiction, right? So nonfiction is pretty popular early on. And it is now. We like to see how people live. We want to know people's private stories. We want to know the truth of their lives. And a large part of what we do is witness to trauma. When we read literature, we read about wars, we read about captivity, and one of the most prolific and effective genres in American literature is the genre of the slave narrative. So, if we could look at this whole title, one of the first slave narratives was from a man named Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa. And the title is The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African. And underneath that, you have, and I won't try to blow it up because I'll lose my place. But right about here, you have written by himself. So Equiano starts writing the story of his enslavement in the United States at a time when what? Educating slaves was illegal. Writing as a slave was illegal. And it was important to the leaders of the nation to believe that African Americans couldn't read and couldn't write and couldn't have a sophisticated thought. So you have this sort of affidavit of veracity written by himself. And so when the slave narratives began to be printed, a lot of times there was some sort of patronage by a well-known white abolitionist who could say, I verify that this person actually wrote this book and I didn't write it for them, like Lydia Maria Child did for Harriet Jacobs. And they constantly had to prove that they could write their own story. So this is from 1789. He talked about Atlantic slavery. There are 12 chapters. He tries to build evidence after evidence. He uses biblical symbolism. He uses classical Greek philosophy and logic every turn to try and persuade the readers that this is an intelligent, evidence-driven narrative. So you can read more about the text. I give you a nice long set of quotes that come from a website devoted to slavery and remembrance. The slave narratives tried to establish a collective truth. They tried to expose the tragedies, the devastation, the suffering, the violence of slavery to a nation that believed that happy darkies were treated like family on the plantations. And so it was their job, according to Toni Morrison, to rip the veil aside from proceedings too difficult to receive. So white abolitionist women would faint during speeches about it, but that's okay. They were there. They could faint anyway, right? So how difficult can you tell this story, right? Well, they come up to the point of some of these gruesome scenes, and then they stop. And Toni Morrison, as a novelist in the 19th century, said, okay, now it's my job to tell the rest of the truth. So she writes fiction, and she doesn't stop for the white lady in the audience who's going to faint. She says, now let me tell you what really happened, right? And so there's a lot of work that we do as readers in American literature to witness. So what's the concept of witnessing? What does that mean? You watch it take place. I mean, I feel like there are two big rubrics under which we think about witnessing. We think about witnessing in a legal term, and we think about witnessing in a spiritual term. So legally, what is a witness?
Someone who witnesses a crime.
Someone who saw it. So an eyewitness, someone who's there, can verify what happened. How accurate are eyewitness accounts?
Very low.
Not all that, but we want them, right? And then, what is the notion of spiritual witnessing? Why is it having an effect on you? I'm gonna tell you how God saved me. I'm gonna tell you how my heart was changed, and I became a better person, right? And so this witnessing that happens in American literature is both of those things. It's a legal attempt to say, this really happened. And it's a spiritual attempt to say, let it change you. Other examples of these kind of collective truth narratives come from other cultures, like I. Rigoberta Menchú, a Guatemalan peasant who wrote about the Guatemalan uprising. The truth of her story was called into question, so she had to have like a white person from New York come and say, hey, it's really happened, and do a little forward in her text. Another one is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. That's a slave narrative, again, written by herself. If you look here, written by herself. So these questions bring up what is true and how can you prove that things are true. The question of truth with a capital T is this notion of eyewitnessing, of having a fact. It's subjective, it's individual, but it's also collective. So in one of the situations that Rigoberta Menchú told about, she told about something that happened, and she said it happened to her brother, and it was an attack. And it turned out, when people did research and looked into it, and journalism, investigative journalism, it was really her cousin. Does it make it not true if it was her cousin instead of her brother? So why would she do that? She would make it a closer family member to just say, hey, I have the right to tell this story, right? But then people are like, no, you lied. We don't believe you anymore. So this is what happens when you try to tell your own story. Sometimes people get in it and are like, we don't believe you. So the case of Equiano is one of those cases. When people started really looking into his life, they said, look, you can't even prove where you were born. Well, how could he prove where he was born? They didn't exactly keep good records of enslaved peoples, right? Medical records. So you can see this little write-up about where Equiano was born and the controversy around that. We had a scholar come maybe 15 years ago and talk to us about, he wrote a book about this, and his name was Vincent Corretta. And from that, I created this little chart. And I want to walk you through it just a little bit, because I'm getting to this point of how we tell the truth that changes our culture. How do we do that in literature? So there's this notion of written evidence about that showed that he was born in South Carolina versus that he was born in Africa. Then there's biological evidence on both sides. Then there's a question of motivation, like he's definitely under investigation, right? Prove it. Prove your own life. Don't just tell me what happened, but you're going to have to prove it, right? Close reading of the text. This is really what we have as literary scholars. What's in there? How does it work? How does it match? How does it not match? Contemporary expectations, contemporary being when the book came out versus now. Some realities that we understand. And you can look at that more closely if you're interested in it. But really, what I want you to look at is this question of the differences. The difference in our concept of the truth between an individual's autobiography and an autobiography meant to represent a group. It's the difference between autobiography for mentorship, like the president or Hamilton, and what is called a testimonio, which in Hispanic culture is something written as a protest. And now we're going to get into something really kind of interesting. Because when we start thinking about Hispanic culture, especially in Latin America, there's a very different relationship with spiritualism. The same is true in African folklore, but let's just stick with Latin America. There's a whole pantheon of Catholic gods and goddesses that come from Aztec gods, not saints that come from Aztec gods and goddesses. And the concept of what is real shifts significantly in these spiritual worldviews. And I'll show you why that's important to what I'm trying to teach you about how literature works. So the next question is, if he changed his life story in his presentation of a slave's life, does Equiano lose our trust? Why or why not? And then why didn't he just present it as a fiction? So there's another example in American Let One. There was a French writer who named de Crèvecoeur who wrote letters from an American farmer to show what life was like on the frontier, like they were letters, but actually it was just a fiction. So in some ways, moving from nonfiction to fiction allows you to be creative and to tell the truth more fully, right? And nobody's going to go do some stupid investigative journalism and say, oh, you know what, there's no eyewitness for that. And actually, the one who was there said that didn't happen, and it didn't happen that way, right? So fiction allows something else to happen. And we're going to get into that now. So we're going to get to how certain writers circumnavigated these accusations by explicitly writing in fantasy instead of realism and memoir when we arrive at Octavia Butler's Afrofuturist magical realism short story, right? So what is Afrofuturism? Have you guys ever heard of that? All right, we're going to play around with that as we go forward. I start jumping a little bit more quickly when I get to things that we're actually going to spend time with in class. Everything you can imagine is real, said Pablo Picasso. So we're now going to be trying to figure out the difference between imagination and reality, and that's a Picasso painting. One of the books we'll spend a lot of time with is Big Fish. Big Fish was written by Daniel Wallace while he was at Altamont, so in some ways it's a Birmingham book. Big Fish is about what's real and what's fantastic, what's true and what's not true, what's partially true, and how, in the end, it's all true. And this is a quote from Tim Burton, who's the director of the film. The film is actually quite beautiful. But a lot of times in this course, I've had students read the book and the film, and they actually prefer the book more than the film in some ways. It's not very long. We're just going to read the book. I talk a lot about Big Fish as the semester rolls out, but for now, let's just say it will give us the opportunity to tell our own tall tales about our people and our elders. Do you want to write the story of your people in realism, and let's just say under that nonfiction? Or do you want to write it in magical realism and fantasy? Why? You don't want anybody to think you're faking, but there are more accusations of faking in realism than in fantasy. It's clearly a fantasy that can't fact check you. Right? So we'll play around with that and how writing in tall tale to say, hey, these are what my people were like and these are what I want you to value in them is maybe an easier way than this harsh realism. We're going to start off the study of magic realism with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's a perfect example of how fantasy is used to create social protest and affect cultural change. He explicitly was writing to end war in his country and to end the human suffering under extremely violent regimes. So we start off with reading A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, and you think that might be fanciful and fun, and it is. But he's trying to save lives. The stakes couldn't be higher in what he's trying to do. So here is an excerpt from an article on Gabriel Garcia Marquez's magical realism. It's often said that the works of Colombian novelist and short story writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez are quintessential examples of magic realism, fiction that integrates elements of fantasy into otherwise realistic settings. So 100 Years of Solitude is a novel, right, that puts the family in a Latin American small town called Macondo, and you have magic carpets and flying ghosts and haunting villagers, those sorts of things. But he does not treat those as out of the realm of possibility. So importantly, these stories are told like in Canto, like that's just what happens, right? So you can read more about surrealism and those sorts of things. In contrast, the American writer William Faulkner wrote extremely harsh realism, really difficult to face, and it was just coarse, right? There wasn't a lot of fantasy. And so Garcia said he thought that Faulkner wrote outlandish things disguised as reality, whereas Garcia Marquez wrote things that were sort of seemed real with outlandish things put in there. But it's all to end wars and to bring down regimes. He says, in Mexico, surrealism runs through the streets. Surrealism comes from the reality of Latin America. So we're looking at a whole different worldview. Also, literature in Latin American countries belongs to the people. It's not this sort of higher elitist kind of thing that is kept separate. It's a very of the people kind of situation, which I'll get into more next week. So I'm almost done. So, well, I don't know. Might not be almost done. I might have to finish on Thursday, but I've got 7 more minutes, so let's see how fast I can go on the rest, okay? You have a quote from Neil Gaiman. A philosopher once asked, are we human because we gaze at the stars, or do we gaze at them because we are human? Pointless, really. Did the stars gaze back? Now that's a question. So Neil Gaiman, whom we'll read at the end, writes fantasy, but he's always taken on American culture, and that is never more true than in his book called American Gods. And he takes the pantheon of gods from all over Europe and puts them in an American culture. It's really fascinating what he has to say about what's really important in America and what's not. So you guys can read that excerpt about Neil Gaiman. So that is narrative, short story, novels. Big Fish is the only novel. The rest of them are short stories. But then there's also poetry and plays. So poetry is non-narrative. Sometimes there's a narrative in it, but most of the time it's not, right? One of my favorite activist poets is a man named William Butler Yeats from Ireland in the early 1900s. He was a spiritualist, an occultist, and a statesman, and a farmer. All these things that we would hold to be separate, he put it all together. He represented Ireland and England to try and get Irish independence. As an elected statesperson, he was very active in the Celtic revival, getting Gaelic back into the country. He started a theater of Gaelic and Irish plays, and then he wrote a lot about the violence that came in Ireland as they were trying to get independence from England. And so again, his poetry is witnessing to trauma. And he's really interesting to me because of the fantasy that shows up in there, but he also says, hey, this isn't fantasy, this is how the world works. And so we'll spend a little bit of time with him. And then I do have a little set of poems that come from the Poetry Foundation. There's a whole section in one of my favorite online archives called the Poetry Foundation on poems of protest, resistance, and empowerment. And you have writers like Maya Angelou and Langston Hughes, Nikki Giovanni, some of these very famous writers, and then less famous writers who are writing their poetry for powerful protest. And you can see how something that only takes somebody a minute to read can really galvanize. You can read it during your activism. You can start chanting it in the streets. We'll look at how poetry works instead of magical realism as protest. The other thing we're going to look at is plays as protest. We go back to Shakespeare. How many of you have ever seen or studied Hamlet? The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king, Hamlet says in that scene where there's the play within the play. And there's this meta moment where Shakespeare, who was parodying leaders, was calling into question political choices in the plays that he wrote, says, hey, this is how you make political commentary. This is how you get people to think in different ways. You tell them a complex story. You depict their lives, and then you show them an outcome and see if that's what they want, right? So Shakespeare specifically worked on the society changing. I have 3 minutes. I'm going to use it. Moments in culture. And then, has anybody ever read The Crucible by Arthur Miller? What's that play protesting? Yeah, maybe it's protesting the burning of witches. You think it's protesting the burning of witches, and it is. But more than that, it's protesting McCarthyism and communism and the Red Scare, and people getting arrested just because of for no apparent reason. So it's all of this allegory that it is taking on, let's not burn women who disagree with people. And why in culture are we worried about the witches instead of the people who burned women? This is a big question in my life. But it's about McCarthyism. Okay. I go on to show you some details about a man named Augusto Boal and the Theater of the Oppressed. And that's just an example, again, from Latin America on how community theater has been devised to end political regimes. And then I give you an excerpt from one of my plays. This is a little bit of vulnerability. I gave you a little moment. Some plays that I've done on community active theater, because that's where I come in. My plays are usually community engaged plays. One was with ambassadors from the HIV clinic, the 1917 clinic called One Clear Light. This one is a sort of memoir, so you can see the sort of magical realism influence. So I gave you a little excerpt on that. And then some other titles, so you can see that this is where my heart is as an academic. And then we're going to have Laura come and visit us soon when we read her book, which is a novel in poetry. And it's going to blow all the genres apart. It is about witches, and it is set in colonial America, but is a whole novel length of a poem. And then all the things that we learned about how all the different genres work it's just going to be bridged and made complicated in this hybrid piece. So that's where we're going. These are some of the overview of what we're going to talk about. Always focusing on how the reader changes, what the writer wanted to change in the reader, and how culture in general changes because this text exists. Okay? Thank you.